but because Alexander held that the possible intellect is generable and corruptible, as a kind of preparation of human nature resulting from the mixing of the elements, as was held in the second. But it is not possible for such a virtue to be raised above material things. He held that our possible intellect can never reach the understanding of separate substances. Yet he maintained that we, according to the state of our present life, are able to understand separate substances. He was trying to show this in this way. When each thing has come to completion in its generation, and to the ultimate perfection of its substance, its own operation, whether action or passion, will be completed. For as operation follows substance, so the perfection of operation follows the perfection of substance. Whence the animal, when it is completely perfect, will be able to walk by itself. Now the habitual intellect, which is nothing else than intelligible species made by the active intellect existing in the possible intellect, has a twofold operation. One is to cause the understood in potential to be understood in act, which it has on the part of the active intellect. The second is to understand what is actually understood. For a man can do these two things through an intellectual attitude. When therefore the generation of the understanding in habit is completed, both of the preceding operations will be completed in him, but it always approaches the completion of its generation, while it acquires new understood species. And so it is necessary that its own generation should sometimes be completed unless there is an obstacle, because there is no generation tending to infinity. Sometimes, therefore, both operations of the understanding will be completed in habit, by the fact that it will do all that is understood in potential in action, which is the completion of the first operation. And by this, he understands all intelligible things, both separated and not separated, which is the completion of the first operation. And by this he understands all intelligible things, both separated and not separated, which is the completion of the first operation. And by this he understands all intelligible things, both separated and not separated. But since the possible intellect cannot understand separate substances, according to its opinion, as has already been said, he intends that we understand through the intellect in habit separate substances, inasmuch as the active intellect, which is placed by itself as a separate substance, will become the form of the intellect in habit and to ourselves, so that we may understand through him as we now understand through possible understanding. And since it belongs to the power of the agent's intellect to make all things understood in act which are intelligible power, and to understand separate substances, in that state we shall understand separate substances, and all intelligible things not separated. And according to this, through this knowledge which is from phantasms, we arrive at the knowledge of a separate substance. It is not as if the phantasms themselves and what is understood through them are some means for knowing separate substances, as happens in the speculative sciences, as the above opinion held. But insofar as intelligible species, there are certain dispositions in us to that form which is the active intellect. And this is the first point in which these two opinions differ. Hence, when the understanding in habit has been perfected by these intelligible species, made in us by the acting intellect, the acting intellect itself will become a form for us, as has been said. And he names the acquired understanding itself, of which Aristotle is said to say that it is from without. And so, although there is no ultimate human perfection in the speculative sciences, as the superior opinion posited, by means of them, however, man is disposed to attain ultimate perfection. And this is the second point in which the second opinion differs from the first. And the third differs in that, according to the first opinion, to understand the active intellect is the cause which continues with us. According to this second opinion, however, it is the other way around. For because it is continuous with us as a form, we understand itself and other separate substances. But these things are said irrationally. For the intellect in habit, like the possible intellect, is held by Alexander to be generable and corruptible. But a generable and corruptible form cannot become eternal according to him. For this reason he posits that the possible intellect which is united to us as form is generable and corruptible, but the active intellect which is incorruptible is a separate substance. Since then, according to Alexander, the active intellect is supposed to be a kind of separate eternal substance, it will be impossible for the active intellect to become the form of the intellect in habit. In addition, the form of the intellect, inasmuch as it is the intellect, is intelligible, just as the form of the sense is sensible. For the intellect does not receive anything, speaking by itself, except intelligibly, just as the sense does not except sensibly. If, therefore, the acting intellect cannot be intelligible through the intellect in habit, it will be impossible for it to be its form. Again, we are told to understand something in three ways. In the first way, as we understand by the intellect which is the virtue from which such an operation proceeds, whence the intellect itself is said to understand, and the very understanding of the intellect becomes our understanding. In another way, as in an intelligible species, by which indeed we are said to understand, not as if it itself understands, but because the intellectual power is accomplished through it in action, just as the visual power is through the species of color. In the third way, as the medium through whose knowledge we arrive at the knowledge of another. If, therefore, a man sometimes understands separate substances by means of an active intellect, this must be said in some manner. But this is not said in the third way, because Alexander does not allow that he understands the active intellect, or the possible intellect, or the intellect in habit, nor even in the second way, because to understand through an intelligible species is attributed to the intellective power of which that species is the intelligible form. But Alexander does not allow that the possible intellect, or the intellect in habit, understands separate substances, whence it cannot be that we understand separate substances by means of the acting intellect in the same way as we understand things by means of an intelligible species. But if, as by intellectual power, the understanding of the agent's intellect must be the understanding of man, but this cannot be unless the substance of the agent's intellect and the substance of man become one according to essence. For it is impossible, if there are two substances different according to essence, that the operation of one should be the operation of the other. Therefore, the acting intellect will be one with man, but not according to being accidental. Because the intellect would no longer be an active substance, but an accident. For thus color and body become one according to accidental existence. It therefore remains that the active intellect is one with man according to substantial being. It will therefore be either the human soul or a part of it and not some separate substance, as Alexander supposes. Therefore, according to Alexander's opinion, it cannot be assumed that man understands separate substances. Further, if the acting intellect will ever become the form of that man, so that it can understand through him, by the same reasoning it will be possible to become the form of another man similarly intelligent through him. It follows, therefore, that two men understand at the same time through the active intellect as well as through their form. Now this is so that the understanding of the agent's intellect itself is the understanding of the intelligent through it, as has already been said. Therefore, the understanding of two intelligent people will be the same. That is impossible. His reason is also completely frivolous. In the first place, because when the generation of a certain kind is completed, it is necessary that its own operation be completed, but still according to the manner of its own kind, and not according to the manner of a higher kind. For when the generation of air is completed, it has a generation and a complete movement upwards, but not so that it is moved to the place of fire. In the same way, when the generation of the intellect in habit is completed, its operation, which is to understand, will be completed according to its own mode, but not according to the mode in which separate substances are understood. That is to say, that it understands separate substances. Hence, from the generation of the intellect in habit, it cannot be concluded that man sometimes understands separate substances. Secondly, because the same power is the complement of the operation of which the operation itself is. If, then, understanding separate substances is the completion of the operation of the intellect in habit, it follows that the intellect in habit sometimes understands separate substances, which Alexander does not state. For it would follow that to understand separate substances would happen through the speculative sciences, which are included under understanding in habit. Thirdly, because of things that begin to be generated, the generation is completed as in most cases, since all generations of things are determined by causes, which result in their effects either always or for the most part. If, therefore, the completion of generation also follows the completion of action, it must also follow that the completed operation results in those things which are generated either always or for the most part. But those who study for the generation of the understanding in habit do not succeed in understanding separate substances, neither in most cases nor always, since no one professes to have reached this perfection. Therefore, the completion of the operation of the intellect is not in the habit of understanding separate substances.